Consequence Podcast Network.
Welcome to another edition of Kyle Meredith with, an audio interview series presented by WFPK Independent Louisville, Consequence of Sound, and the Consequence Podcast Network. Where are you listening from today? If you're listening from YouTube, go ahead and subscribe over there. And if you're checking out the podcast, please do leave us a rating or a review. I'm Kyle Meredith. Today my guest is J.R. Richards of the band Dishwalla. You know, when you've got a hit as big as their mid-90s single, Counting Blue Cars, you're going to be faced with the difficult task of following that up. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary of their album, And You Think You Know What Life's About. It wasn't the easiest thing to go through. JR tells us of depression that he faced around that time, regime change around their record labels that ultimately did not help with the promotion of it. But we also talk about the good moments going into it. There's also a connection to that late 90s movie, The Avengers. Not the one today, the old one, the one that is just slammed and looked at as one of the worst movies of all time. But they're on the soundtrack. We get to talk about that as well. And speaking of film, that's what JR does these days. He's in film and TV scoring. He's doing Baywatch, and we'll get into that, as well as his work with How I Met Your Mother and his upcoming covers album and fifth solo record. It's Kyle Meredith with J.R. Richards of Dishwalla.
Hey, Kyle, it's JR.
How are you, JR?
I'm doing well, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for calling. I want to talk about the second Dishwalla record, which I feel like probably doesn't get enough attention, as much attention as definitely the first one. But I was noticing that And You Think You Know What Life's About is turning 20 this year. I don't know if you... Do you pay attention to the anniversaries as they start creeping in?
I do. I try not to think about it too much because I'm always so surprised that it's been that long because it doesn't seem like it was that long ago.
Well, let's figure it out because this record, you know, it becomes its own important thing because this is the one to follow up a hit record. You know, Counting Blue Cars had been such a huge hit. I mean, you ended up getting a Billboard award on that one, and I think I saw something like an ASCAP or a BMI like most performed song of the year. But this is to follow up a hit like that. What pressures went in on this record as you were heading into this one that you remember?
Oh, well, I do remember very specifically because it was a tremendous amount of pressure. And, you know, being the main songwriter, it was a huge weight on my shoulders. I mean, certainly I put it there upon myself as well as, you know, now you're getting all this pressure from the label, you know, which wasn't there the first time because the label was already very happy with the songs that we had brought to them. So there was no pressure in putting those songs together. But now there was, you know, coming from a successful record. And of course, they want to keep that momentum going because they just made a tremendous amount of money. So let's keep this going. You know, JR, where are the hits at? You know, they basically wanted 10 or 12 Counting Blue Cars. So yeah, that's a heavy duty amount of pressure.
Yeah. Now, how did the band handle the success when it did happen? I mean, did it feel like this was a comfortable glove for you all? Did you take to it easily? Some bands do, some bands don't.
No, I think we took it pretty easily. I mean, we're all pretty grounded guys, and certainly if somebody's getting a little too big for their shoes, usually somebody's right there to knock them back down to size. So I think we handled it pretty well. And I also think that a lot of what was going on was we didn't really notice. I think, as you know, when you're in a tour bus or a van, you know, for years, you're kind of living in a time machine. So you would step out. I mean, you start to notice that you're playing bigger venues and or opening for bigger artists, but really your daily chores don't really change. So it's hard to gather how big. And I remember, you know, you had label people going, you have no idea how big, you know, this record is going or how well it's doing at radio or it's blowing up in this country. And you just kind of go, yeah, whatever, because they're always kind of blowing smoke to a large degree. So, you know, but they were right. It really was a big deal. And in hindsight, I can see that. But at the time, I don't think we noticed as much. So therefore, I don't think we got too caught up in it.
Now you've got, you know, as they say, you've got all the time in the world to make your first record, and then to have that success happen, and here the label is saying, all right, it's time to do another one. What was, you know, with that pressure being on you, how was the writing going into And You Think You Know What Life's About? You probably use a shorter version of that when you're talking about it, don't you?
It's funny. Yeah, we just use the acronym on it, you know, AYTYNWLA. So, because that your hand starts to hurt after a while writing that one out. But it's actually a phrase from one of the songs, and I think it's from a song Scott wrote once in a while. But And I think that kind of pays homage to the whole idea that, you know, when we did finally get to that point, and the reality of that this is a business now, not just fun, sets in, is that, you know, that idea that you think you know what you're doing, but you don't.
Yeah.
And so that, I think that's where the album's title, certainly for me, kind of comes from. But yes, the writing for the second album, you have your whole life up to that point to write that first record, and then the second one you have months, and it's difficult to write on tour because you know, for me, I was constantly having to save my voice, so it was difficult to sit and with a guitar and sing things out. So I had to do that sparingly. And whenever we did have any kind of, you know, week off or anything like that, the other guys would all take off generally, but I would usually sit at home on the piano and see what I could come up with. I did, you know, and I did have a pretty serious bout of depression at that time too, because I was under so much pressure. And I wrote one of the first songs to the album, Until I Wake Up, was all about handling and dealing with that pressure of the only time I really felt like I could relax was when I was finally have to go to sleep at night.
That song, by the way, do I remember it had started as a B-side on the Counting Blue Cars single?
Right. I'd written it early on, so after the first album. So it ended up because Counting Blue Cars didn't get released as a single till maybe 6 months after we finished the record, or released the record even. So yeah, it ended up being on the CD single as a B-side.
I've always got I don't know, some kind of affinity for the sophomore records, because it's interesting knowing that, you know, the band's back is against the wall in a sort of way. Even if it's a super successful record, your back is against the wall. And if it's not, you know, then you've got to worry about being dropped or something like that when you look back at all that. And there's something about that sophomore record that's always been, I don't know, sort of romantic in my eyes, because it's like the prove yourself moment, you know, and you just hear all these great songs all over this record to show that, you know, it wasn't a fluke, which is gotta be nice when you look back.
Oh, well, that's nice to hear. I think that, you know, the record was kind of rushed. I think there was a lot of second guessing going on about how we should make the record. We went a very traditional route the first time with the Butcher Brothers, and I think that you know, from everywhere from our label, we lost our A&R person too, and you know, and I think he was a very critical part of making sure things stayed on track. And, you know, we didn't go with our producer from the first album. We didn't record it the same way. We built a home studio. We got a producer that was very avant-garde and maybe much less known than a lot of the producers we were looking at. And we did a lot of the recording ourselves. So, you know, a lot of it felt kind of rushed to me in a lot of ways. But it's nice to hear that you enjoyed the record.
Yeah. Well, the interesting...
we got paid up a bit.
Well, I know it didn't. It ultimately didn't have the impact as Pet Your Friends. You know, when it came out, and I don't know, because when you're working and you've got, you know, maybe a multi-album deal. I don't know how it was set up for you, but you know, I don't know. Was it felt at the time when you came off like, man, that didn't work as well as the first one did, or was it just like, you know, the work finishes, the tour finishes, and you get back on your horse and you get ready for the next album?
Yeah, I don't think there's really time to think about it. I mean, we did the best that we could at the time, and we had, you know, I think we made a great record. It was much more, it was very different from the first record, and I guess that was a big part of that thought of, let's do something different. I think probably went against the label, hoping we would do something very similar. So we did spend a lot of time playing songs to the label and them going, we don't really feel it yet. So, you know, that was difficult. And the only other big issue was, that turned out to be the big issue, is I think about a day after we released our album, our label basically was bought and sold. So, and we didn't know it. I think a lot of people at the label knew it. So there really wasn't at all the same kind of push that we had on the first album, unfortunately, just because there was no money or personnel there to really do the job.
Man, it's such a sad story when you hear that about bands, about albums. You know, some of the great albums in history sort of lost just because regime change. You know, the art doesn't get heard as much as it used to. You
are right about that. A lot of some of the best bands in the world that nobody will ever know about because of regime change or something that happened to the label, so they never got their opportunity.
Now, on the sound, you were kind of talking about it a little bit a minute ago, not sounding like the first one. I do find it interesting to sort of A-B the two records, because Pet Your Friends, it sounds a lot like what we were hearing in '95, and with What Life's About really sounds how music had started to sound like in '98. It had become thicker, chunkier, and those sounds are heard. I mean, you're always a rock band, and you always had big chunky songs, but there was something bigger about this record in the production. Did you go into the songwriting thinking like, okay, this is the way music is going and we want to take it, or is that sort of just part of the the coincidence of the the zeitgeist in the era?
That's a good question. I think that it, especially when you write a song and you bring it into this group of guys, and we also had a new member in the band too on the second record, Jim Wood, who's now playing keyboards, and so you have a lot of different personalities and guys that are hearing it being a certain way and all being influenced by different things. So I'm sure, and when you're immersed in the music industry too, you are hearing other bands doing interesting things that you haven't heard before. And so I think, you do tend to take some of that home with you when you're working on your own songs. But I don't think it was too conscious. I think the idea of being more experimental in general was a big part of making the second album as opposed to the first one.
There's a great track on there that kind of speaks to that with Truth Serum, which ended up on the Avengers soundtrack as well. A bomb of a movie, a really good soundtrack.
I know.
But that song, I mean, there's such a cool laid back feel to that, and this was also the era of trip hop, I guess we should say, and I feel a little bit in that song as well. What do you remember about that one?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was because the verses are very, very groovy and kind of trip hoppy. George is great with those kind of beats, and then the chorus is very driving and very straight. So, with big rock guitars and everything. So it was a nice, I loved stuff with contrast and switching gears and things like that. I think it really helps keep your attention. And, Counting Blue Cars is very much like that. It's very kind of dreamy, verses that are kind of groovy, and then the chorus is really big and powerful and driving. So, and you can really feel the gears change between the parts. And I'm not a big fan of things that are too linear. So yeah, we would definitely, I think even in Gone Upside Down has kind of a trip hop kind of beat to it, even though when I wrote that, I was listening to a lot of really, really heavy bands at the time. So it's got a really chunky guitar riff thing mixed with that kind of trip hop drum beat.
Yeah, I mentioned that being tied to Avengers with Truth Serum. I was going back and God, I'd forgotten all about that movie too, and hearing reviews call that one of the worst movies of all time, especially of the era. Is there a sense of being tied to that, or was like just being on the soundtrack still completely separate from whatever happens with a movie?
Thank God it was separate. I mean, we've been on a lot of movies, but never one that bombed quite that badly. So that was a bit tough. I was excited to be on a soundtrack. I was excited to have that song on a soundtrack. I was like, oh, cool! It's such a cool song. I don't know if this is a radio song or not, but perhaps it will be heard, and maybe it will be a radio song if the movie does well. And then seeing the movie and going, well, I don't need to worry about that. 'Cause I don't think it's gonna happen.
But we'll move into the present a little bit, because that became a big part of your life after Dishwalla. Like, you have spent a lot of time scoring and working in TVs and movies, right?
Yeah, I know. It's funny. I'm actually working on songs for Baywatch right now.
Wow. How did all that happen? How did you get into that side of the career?
Well, I mean, I think perhaps part of it's probably doing it for a long time, because that's where a lot of guys go. Jeff Russo from Tonic has won quite a few Academy Awards, or maybe even a Grammy or two from scoring like Star Trek to Fargo. So I think, when you're writing songs and you're soundscaping things out and you're really thinking about all those details, you start to learn how to, create moods, and it translates really well to doing movies. And a movie that I had acted in around 2001, a movie called Morning. It was directed by Amy Kanan Mann, and her father is Michael Mann, the very famous film director. So it was a big production, and she'd hired this guy to score the film, and he was a huge film score, and she hated it. And so right at the last, 11th hour, she calls me up and says, hey, can you score this thing for me? So I was like, how much time do I have? She's like, you've got a few days, to score a whole film. So pulled it all together. But that was kind of the beginning of me actually really thinking about film. And so, here I am still doing it.
Yeah, we've seen you, of course, you worked in How I Met Your Mother in and out through its seasons, and they end up using the band name, calling it out a few times. I mean, that's
yes,
kind of be cool to be of that part of pop culture.
No, it's so cool, and when they were putting the episode together, they would literally, call me and be like, okay, Gerald, we need a version of Counting Blue Cars that's a dreamy version for a dreamy sequence, or we need one that's like a jukebox version that's and then we need an actual album version and studio version. So I ended up writing all these different versions for the show. Unfortunately, they didn't use them all, but that's how those things go. When they're writing their things, they're constantly changing it, and they were kind of using me as a tool. Like, hey, can you come up with this? And I was like, sure, no problem, I'll go for it.
That's cool. So you mentioned Baywatch. I mean, is there anything else that we should be looking out for at the moment on that side of things?
Not too much. I mean, I'm doing that. I have a couple other things going that I'm not allowed to talk about until they're official, I guess. But and hopefully I'll be able to talk about them. It means that they're going ahead with it, which is cool. But I think you spend a lot of time writing and working on things kind of on spec in hopes that the show will get picked up or the movie will go forward or your song will get used. But you have to be hush hush about it in the meantime. Right. And then I'm also working on a covers album, believe it or not, because which will be my fourth solo album, and then as well as another studio album, which will be my fifth. So I'm busy working on that.
Yeah.
Right now.
And you've been doing it sort of on the is it a subscription service is what it looks like on the website, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the world has changed, so it's like I have people that have enjoyed Dishwalla or my solo stuff helping, kind of being my label. They're a huge part of it, and they get, and yeah, it's so weird, but it is the kind of new age of how artists operate these days in order to afford to keep making music. So because getting record deals is harder to come by these days, and you lose so much of your control as well as a lot of the percentage of the dollar that you might make. So it actually makes sense to do much of it on your own, which you can do, and subscription service is a really cool way to go. And then you make it really interesting for the people who are into your music. They get to hear music way before anybody else does, help you make decisions, hear things that nobody will ever hear, and really be much more a part of the process, because I do updates and videos. My wife's a film director, so she helps me put together some pretty amazing video updates and things like that. So that's what's literally making it possible for me to keep going. It's amazing, and I felt really odd doing it first, because I did my third album that I wanted to, my second solo album I did on a pledge music campaign, which is basically a crowdfunding way of raising money for an album. And I figured out how much I would need and ended up raising more than twice that. And so I did two albums.
On that covers record, is there a theme to it, or is it just like favorite songs?
It really is just like favorite songs of mine. And although, again, with that subscription service, I call it the green room. That's what I call it. Probably half of the album is going to be songs they chose.
Oh, cool.
So
any odd ones? Are they throwing like any challenges at you? Like you've got to do whatever it would be.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, they've thrown some hard ones my way. I mean, they threw me close to 100 actually in a couple of days. So I was going through and seeing how many times, because some of the titles were obviously were suggested more than once, and then trying to for the most part I knew all the songs, and going through all of them trying to figure out if I can do these songs justice. So as long as I can, I'll probably wheedle it down, but I will pull from the list that I got from my subscribers and do 4 or 5 of those.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's definitely some weird ones. I mean, there's like Broadway show tunes and weird, obscure artists that I've never heard of before, but all fantastic stuff. It's just trying to figure out if I can do it justice.
I mean, do you want to tell us any of the names that we would know, or is that still going to be kept under wraps until it's time?
Well, I mean, there's a couple. I mean, like I'm doing With or Without You by U2, Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers.
Oh, yeah.
House of the Rising Sun by the Animals. I guess that's a few there.
Yeah.
I can't think of what else.
Oh, that's cool. Well, I look forward to that. When should we maybe expect these? This one and possibly the follow-up as well?
Yeah, well, the covers record should be done in a couple months tops. I think that'll be out, and then hopefully a couple of months after that I'll have the other album done. It might take a little bit longer. Depends. I'm looking at doing a tour in November and some of October right now. So some of October and November. So it depends on how much time I have to sit in the studio.
Right. That's always the thing, man. Time management. That's,
Yeah.
That's it. Well, JR, thank you, man. I look forward to all that. Thank you for taking the time, and especially, going back down memory lane for the And You Think You Know What Life's About record. It's cool to kind of get the backstory on that one, as it's, like I said, that spotlight's been on that one a little bit less. So I appreciate it.
Oh, no, I appreciate you shining some light on it. That's fantastic.
Well, take care and let us know when the new records come out. We'll be watching for them.
All right, man. I'll reach out to you when it's out.
All right, I appreciate it.
I'll shoot it out to you. You bet, man. All right.
All right, take care.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Bye.
You too.
Hey, thanks so much to J.R. Richards for giving me the call today to talk about Dishwalla's And You Think You Know What Life's About 20 years this year. Don't forget, you can subscribe to Consequence of Sound's YouTube channel to keep up with your favorite artists and interviews. And for you podcast listeners, please do leave us a review and a rating if you're listening on iTunes, Podchaser, or wherever you may be getting this from. And then head over to WFPK.org. That's where I do a show every Monday through Thursday from noon to 3 Eastern. I'm Kyle Meredith. I'll see you next time.
Consequence Podcast Network.